This session between now and when we break for lunch is focused on ending forced treatment, involuntary detention and mental health laws. Just a small agenda for us to address in the next hour and a half. I'm sure we'll be able to, get through it easy. Each of our speakers will be presenting a slightly different focus on mental health laws and our ability to be able to end enforced treatment and involuntary detention. And we start off with Nell Munro, who's an assistant professor in law at the University of Nottingham. And as you'll all know, in the back of the program, there's more detailed biographies that you can refer to. But Nell, if you'd like to start us off on this tour de force of ending forced treatment.
Thank you, Rosemary, very much. I probably won't end forced treatment in 20 minutes.
Oh, 10.
What I am going to do is talk about two things. One is the idea of liberty as it's expressed in various human rights documents, and in particular, how deprivation of liberty is defined in the CRPD. And then I'm going to talk about a particular case study of abuse of the right to liberty of disabled people in my country, in England. And my central argument is very simple. It's that the right to liberty of disabled people hasn't really been realised yet. We haven't begun to get close to thinking about realising the substance of disabled people's right to liberty. And there may be two reasons for this. The first is the one that Luke summarised so brilliantly in his presentation this morning. I don't think I would express it so much as lawyers, but certainly our obsession with process. Because we focus so heavily on the process content of the right, we fail to look at what substantively not being deprived of one's liberty means. And the second is that we have not yet really engaged with the question of what does it mean for disabled people who might have very challenging behaviours. And I'm sorry, I don't like the concept of challenging behaviour. I'm going to use it for want of anything better here, because it's the term that's used in English policy, or who are experiencing very profound mental distress. Somebody this morning asked, how does this human rights law work when we're talking about somebody who has psychosis, for example? How do we protect their rights to live in the community on an equal basis with others? And that question is a very, very difficult one. We haven't crystallised it. We haven't begun to realise its full impact. During the break, Charles said to me, could you just define psychosocial disabilities for us at the start? So, cheers, Charles. Thank you very much. I can't define it for the benefit of everyone in this audience. I can define how I will use it for the purpose of this presentation. For me, psychosocial disabilities is the concept we use in international human rights law to capture the population of people who have what in English law we refer to as mental disorders, because in English law, mental disorders is also defined very broadly. People who experience complex mental distress, people who experience cognitive impairments, people who experience neurological difficulties that have significant impacts on their day-to-day life. They need not necessarily be permanent. Rosemary herself referred this morning to the fact many people with psychosocial disabilities recover. And many psychosocial disabilities are episodic in nature. People have fluctuating experiences. I have epilepsy, and some people who have epilepsy find that a profoundly disabling condition. But by its nature, it fluctuates. I'm completely conscious at the moment, I believe. Tell me if that changes. But I would also add, other people are entitled to use different definitions for that term. Deprivation of liberty is perhaps the oldest human right on the block. Arguably, it's been in use since the 13th century. If you're an English human rights lawyer, you think that that's what the barons made King John sit down at Runnymede and protect for people. That's probably a slightly fairy tale picture of what was happening when King John signed the Magna Carta. But we certainly have, in international human rights law, a right to liberty protected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the European Convention on Human Rights, and in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. All of these expressions are subtly different. And importantly for disabled people in England, the European Convention on Human Rights, which is part of the legal order of the United Kingdom, or sort of England and Wales under our Human Rights Act, states that everyone has the right to liberty and security of person. They cannot be deprived of liberty except in accordance with a procedure prescribed by law, but that states may deprive persons of their liberty where they are of unsound mind. That phrase of unsound mind has dogged the relationship between the European Convention on Human Rights and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, because in Council of Europe member states, including the United Kingdom, it is both commonplace and consistent with the Convention to allow detention on the basis of mental disability subject to a legal procedure. The same phrasing doesn't arise in other international legal instruments. There's a little bit of interesting history to that phrase. It's there because the British delegation to the Council of Europe argued that we should be allowed to restrict the liberty of persons when they are of unsound mind. So my apologies, it's the fault of the British. Sorry. But importantly, all those statements on the right to liberty emphasise that the good of the right to liberty is that you can't be arbitrarily deprived of it. You can only be deprived of it subject to a process. The good of liberty is process. What does the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities add to that? It adds two things. The existence of disability shall in no case justify a deprivation of liberty. Article 14, 1b. So when we are depriving people on the basis, or when the state is empowered to deprive an individual of their liberty, it cannot use disability as the basis for that detention. And if, nevertheless, a person with a disability ends up in detention for other objectively justifiable reasons, They must be treated in compliance with the objectives and principles of the Convention, including reasonable accommodations. So where a person with a disability is imprisoned, quarantined, placed in immigration detention, they must still be able to access reasonable accommodations. Which in itself does not look like a radical restatement of the existing right to liberty. But 10 years on from the opening of, well, 11 years on, sorry, from the passing of the CRPD, not a lot has changed on the ground in many member states, and many states which have ratified the CRPD, in changing domestic legislation to ensure compliance. And I want to explore in practice what this has meant for disabled people. I'm going to use a very, very sad case study, and I'm sorry if these images offend anyone. In England, we've already talked at length about the right to independent living. In England, most people with learning disabilities live in the community, either in some form of small-scale residential care, something quite close to the group homes that Nolene Fox was describing, or increasingly, because this is the preferred model of care under the Care Act, in their own homes, in a flat that they will fund themselves with support workers they should be employing themselves. And in some cases, adults still live with family members. Exceptionally, people with learning disabilities who also exhibit what are described as challenging behaviours, but what we could equally describe as behaviours other people find difficult to manage, are accommodated in hospitals. Some of these hospitals are run and funded by the National Health Service. Some of these hospitals are provided by the private sector. The Winterbourne View scandal took place 6 years ago. It began more than 6 years ago. It began in 2003 when a private provider, Castlebeck, was commissioned to provide a new hospital for 24 people with learning disabilities in Gloucestershire. I'm reminded of a poem I learnt at school which went, the scene of the crime was the goldfish bowl, that was the scene and that was the crime. Because in 2003, it was already the case that government policy was to discontinue the creation of new institutions for people with learning disabilities outside the community. So even the building and funding of this hospital 14 years ago ran counter to then government policy. Nevertheless, it was built. It was built by an independent provider, and it took admitted patients from all over the country. Some of the patients were admitted from as far as 200 miles away. From 2008 to 2011, there was an absolute crisis in management at this hospital. And a huge number of incidents of abuse by care staff towards the patients were reported to police and to the Care Quality Commission, the independent regulator for care services in England and Wales. Eventually, after a number of whistleblowing incidents, the BBC Panorama programme sent a journalist working undercover into the hospital to film what was going on. And they showed, you can see the images here, patients being kicked, punched, and forcibly stripped by the staff. There was a culture of abuse within this hospital. The manager was deliberately concealing the abuse that was taking place by writing up the evidence of injuries as justifiable restraints in the incident book, so that when regulators went in to find out what was happening, they saw that there was evidence of injuries, but these were described as incidents that had taken place that were justified because the person was behaving aggressively. A police investigation was launched. 11 members of staff were prosecuted, 6 went to prison. The country was scandalised. Whenever a major incident of adult abuse takes place, national guidance requires that a serious case review is launched. And a social worker who carried out this review said, hospitals like Winterbourne View should not exist, and that there is an urgent need to halt the practice of commissioning hospital places for people with learning disabilities. This was in 2012. 2 years later, a review by the Department of Health discovered that rather than the number of hospital places for people with learning disabilities reducing in those 2 years, they had increased. There were now more people deprived of their liberty in hospitals like Winterbourne View across England. And another urgent review was commissioned. That commission argued that there needed to be central government coordination of the process of decommissioning hospital services for people with learning disabilities. And the Transforming Care programme was set up, which began in 2015 and is still ongoing. I'm not going to go into the details of the outcome. We haven't closed all of these hospital places. What I think is interesting about the Winterbourne View case is not the outcome or the scandal, it's the silence over liberty. A minority of the patients at Winterbourne View were legally deprived of their liberty. Some of them were detained under the Mental Health Act. Some of them were deprived of their liberty under what are called the Deprivation of Liberty safeguards. So they were technically deprived of their liberty under the Mental Capacity Act. Many of them were not subject to any formal detention procedure whatsoever. All of them were factually deprived of their liberty because they could not leave the hospital. But fascinatingly, in the 6 years since the conditions of care at Winterbourne View were exposed, and since the Department of Health announced that it was committed to closing all of these hospitals, there has been no discussion about the content of the right to liberty of people who are detained in hospital settings. One reason for this may be that there's a conflict domestically between the right enshrined in the European Convention of Human Rights to liberty, which allows people of unsound mind to be deprived of their liberty. And the case Luke mentioned, the Bournemouth ruling, which upped the ante and actually said we need to ensure that whenever somebody with a learning disability is deprived of their liberty, due process is observed. We now have very, very stringent safeguards for ensuring that people deprived of their liberty have some kind of process observed in ensuring that that's not arbitrary. At the same time, the CRPD does not allow disability to be used as the basis for deprivation of liberty. It's highly probable that local authorities and the Department of Health charged with implementing the Transforming Care agenda just don't know how to work with those two conflicting imperatives. And behind that is this conflict that Luke has already mentioned between substance and process. Because human rights law in England has told us process matters, but it doesn't tell us why liberty matters to people. It doesn't tell us that it is much more important to be in a small facility, to have choice and control over who is caring for you, to know that people will listen to you when you say, I don't like this person who's caring for me. It doesn't tell us about the content of one's liberty. And so because all of the people who live at Winterbourne View will still be legally deprived of their liberty, even when they live in a flat in the community, because our processes for protecting people's procedural rights are so stringent, there's a danger we haven't looked at the substance and thought about what it means to people. And underlying all of this is discrimination. We haven't yet recognised that people with learning disabilities are people just like us, as Wolfensberger was arguing back in the 1970s. And so we tend to have a failure of imagination when thinking about how to support people whose behaviour other people find very, very difficult to manage. When people exhibit very, very difficult behaviour, when they hurt themselves very badly, when they behave very aggressively, when they say things that are very frightening, the temptation is always to treat them as if they are very different, very unlike everyone else, and need very specialist interventions. In a hospital, out in the countryside, far away from everyone else. And it is very hard to reach the challenge, to meet the challenge of thinking, how can we support that person in their flat, close to the people they know, with support workers on site, who they've already chosen to support them. But that is the challenge of achieving the right to independent living and the right not to be deprived of one's liberty under the CRPD. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nell, for highlighting the difficulty in analysing and identifying the nuances in deprivation, but also pointing out that due process is only available to those that are there because there's a legal process that got them there. What about those that end up in institutional care because there aren't any other options and due process is not an option for them? And the challenge of putting in the effort to truly understand how congregate care and support services can deprive people of their liberty, and the challenge for society to really move beyond seeing people with disability as other and then justifying congregate care as an option that leave them at risk of violence and abuse, as that case clearly demonstrated. Next we have Dr. Mary Kayess, who's from the School of Law here at the National University of Ireland in Galway, and she is going to look at mental health laws and the CRPD. Please, if you have any questions that you want to ask Nell and any of the other panellists, please note them during the speakers, and we will have questions and answers at the end. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rosemary, and hello to everybody. I'm going to talk about mental health law and the CRPD in a very roundabout way, and I hope it works for you. It's a new idea. So anyway, my content, I'm going to briefly talk about diagnosis. I'm going to talk about a piece of research that was finished here in the west of Ireland just a number of months ago, and I'm going to talk about the possibility of new law enabling positive experience and embracing the values of the CRPD. Now, I decided I would go back to probably not even pre-medical model day, but pre-pharmaceutical industry day, pre-extensive prescription, pre-lots of drugs in treatment days. So I went back to the kind of diagnosis in the 1800s, in that era in Ireland. We were a country of many institutions. We had an institution for every, as we saw it in society, problem. Now we don't have any of the large institutions anymore used for mental health care, but it's only a sliver away from being reawakened in some other format, in my view. So I decided to look at that because diagnosis is one of the main gatekeepers for coercive admission and treatment. So this is why I decided to have a look. So one of the big diagnostic categories way back then was mania. And this it will probably have resonance for people, around the world, because there are familiarities in all of it. So they very much looked at why, what had happened to the person, what had happened rather than what's wrong with you. So somebody excess, these are the words that were used, poverty, with drinking excess of porter, that's a form of drink. Sunstroke, I never got to the bottom of that one. Mental annoyance, psychological traumas from a beating received. Now, the reason I am doing this as well is these are very significant social factors in the life of a person. And they recognised then that these social factors had an impact on the psyche of a person. They were traumatic for them. So they had this reason attached. Each person had a reason for it. There was a cause. So psychological trauma from a beating received or from falling from a horse, reflective of the time, or shock. When the person was admitted following the shock of his brother being sent to an asylum, the brother suffered from religious excitement, which was a very common diagnosis then. And you see resonance of that now brought forward in a more modern words. Pride, anger, love and jealousy was one that is of interest to us all. But in the south of Ireland, at one particular, I think it was actually in the 1890s, in the south of Ireland, there were something like 29 people suffering from love and jealousy, the effect of love and jealousy being the reason they were in the hospital. So whatever was going on in Cork at that time, I'm not sure. But it was all in one area, but it could have been a very active psychiatrist. Anyway, so for women then, there were other issues. Intemperance was one that was very easily attached to a woman. But poverty, and these are the things that are really important about this. Poverty, hardship, pecuniary disappointment. I really liked that because I think so many of us might suffer from pecuniary disappointment at times. Domestic troubles, adverse circumstances, mental anxiety, worry, grief, loss of employment. How different. The desire to leave the workhouse. That was the place where the poorest of the poor went in Ireland around the time of the famine, and when they had no other recourse to anything, they went into what's called workhouses, and some of the buildings are still there. Religious excitement, again, similar to men, sunstroke, fright and shock. So I just leave that for a moment. So then diagnosis in 2017, and it's a very different looking. I have a sense of it being very almost technical in nature. The human side of it doesn't come through at all in the same way as it did then in terms of looking at the holistic life of the person. So I suppose words like mental disorder embracing a very wide range of things, but what does that really mean? And then we have the DSM-5, which is, it's a diagnostic manual that's used to really for psychiatrists around the world, so they can diagnose somebody and place them in a category where they can then be treated. So it's a really influential document, but a very limited evidence-based, and it's now expanding into areas of ordinary human condition, the human experience, very much obviously the backbone of the biomedical approach. So in some ways, the DSM-5 and the sort of underpinning of power that goes with it is pulling in the opposite direction to the CRPD, in my view. It's, pathologizing what is ordinary ordinary human reactions to life, where life gets you at times. And the UN Special Rapporteur, Danius, who was here on Monday, refers to this, the overexpansion of diagnostic categories, often without this solid scientific basis. And we're more and more realising that. Also, there's a growing concern at the extensive reliance on drug treatments, because it's like a continuum. You have one, you'll have the other. And then you'll have, delving into the area of coercion again. Legal actions are now being taken by certain groups and individuals due to the adverse consequences of drugs. And one very recent one that's interesting to look at is the Wendy Dolan, the wife of a man who was put on Paxil, a drug that has been discredited. It was manufactured by GSK, the pharmaceutical company GSK, but it was a secondary body that actually manufactured it. Anyway, there was a legal action and she won her case to challenge it because her husband took his own life shortly after being put on these drugs, and he had akathisia. And, so she was successful, but it doesn't mean she'll be successful all the way, because I think the case is possibly going to be challenged by, the drug company isn't going to let this go easily. But at the same time, if you look, you'll see that's happening increasingly, and I think that kind of a legal approach is very useful. We in Ireland could learn from it, because there seems to be lots of potential in that area. But again, she came from a very powerful society. Her husband was a lawyer in a very big firm in Chicago or Illinois, somewhere anyway. So that's a factor as well. So I'm leaving diagnosis now very suddenly and I'm moving on, but there is a connection and I hope you'll see the connection. Here in the west of Ireland, we did this study recently, a group of people, and Liz Brosnan was involved in it as well. And we were sort of collaborators and on the kind of the outer reaches of it. But I'm just looking at one of the studies. There were a couple of studies done, and this was the qualitative study involving 50 interviews with people who were in the larger study, which involved about 300 people at the start. So you can see there the range of people, males and females as far as possible. And there were 27 participants who had previous experience of being detained. Others had voluntary status on admission. And that's really important, because sometimes we fool ourselves in saying, oh, we in Ireland, we've 10% of all admissions are involuntary. So we're grand. We're kind of keeping up with the international norms. But actually, the truth of it is that, the voluntary status, there are, as you know, huge questions over it, and I'll come back to that. But I've just given you the reference there, and the study will be on the CDLP website. It's not there at the moment, but it will be. So the focus of what I'm taking from that particular part of the study, I'm not taking it all because there isn't time, but the experience of the process of transfer from home and detention, the experiences of hospital, going home, and person-centred encounters. So there's quite a lot of negative response. So the experience anyway of transfer and detention is where the people felt very disengaged and unsupported. So they were at home in crisis situation where somebody had organised for the local service to get involved, and this was the response of the people. This is a really critical point for people, where the fear that people have is at its height, and there's probably a lot of difficulty in the home if family feels this person should get treatment and they don't think they should, and so on and so forth. So it's a really, really sensitive, it probably could be handled so much better and differently if you had alternatives. But the responses of the people were this: feeling trapped and coerced, feeling stigmatised and criminalised, leading to exacerbation of distress. So you have a situation where there is this process which adds on a whole other layer to a person who is having psychosocial distress. So it adds on a layer that no other illness requires a person to be put through, and ending up for some people with post-traumatic stress. So it's a double situation, and I think we need to be very aware of that. And it's, in my view, it's unconscionable that we would do that in this situation. So I'm going to. Oh, what's happened there? Oh, right, okay. I'm pressing the wrong buttons probably. Okay, so I'm really just giving you a few quotes here, and I hope people are okay with it, that you won't find it too upsetting. But, the comments are from men and women. It's very frightening, you're very confused, you want to sort of stand up and defend yourself, but you know it's pointless because you're surrounded. They had me ambushed, surrounded. So that overwhelming sense of invasion, violation, shock and coercion. Shock was a word used in the 1890s as well. So also the whole sense of being alone as well in the next one, where I was sure that someone I knew would come and help me, trying to find a voice, like I remember lying down on the floor, all the men, the members of the assisted admission team pushing me down, and I was trying to find a voice I could recognise, someone I knew to say, please help me, I haven't done anything wrong. So if we're talking about the continuation of mental health laws, and Ireland reformed our laws in 2001 to make them human rights compliant, I'm not sure that you could ever argue that. So the difficulty here is as well, on top of all of this, you have this assisted admissions team. And as an aside, despite us having regulation, reformed mental health law, and this is a warning to people who are drafting new laws, this assisted admission team that is centralised nationally is not regulated by anybody other than the people who pay, which is the HSE, the Health Service Executive, or, So rather than having a local team that the person might know, that could coax the person to come along and be kind and give them time and so on and find alternatives, you have this profit-driven team, because it's a bottom line, it's a private company, coming in as strangers to your home and taking you out of your home. And they may have to go somewhere else and somewhere else. So they may not have time to talk to you with the best will in the world. But it's not regulated. And that's a real concern of mine, that, that you have that out there. Okay. So, and people said, like, you can't control your own house. So further experience of the process, no communication of the plan. So you're there and no one's telling you what's happening. You get misleading and false information. We're just going along for a little while. We're just doing this, not giving you clear information. This is what's happening. I'm here to support you. What do you want to do? What would you prefer? Etc. Nothing was explained to me. No one even said where my family had gone to. Why was I even there? I didn't realise until I was, I suppose, in the vehicle on the way going down there to the hospital, and even at that stage I wasn't even sure where I was going. So, well, as you say, I was unaware of what was going on. If you like, I was kind of convicted and tried. Without any say in the matter, I was treated like a convicted criminal. I was taken from my place of work against my will. I was in a cell, yeah. That was, that was from a female in that situation. So that's the experience of the process that we feel is okay here. And I don't think it is really. The stigma that we talk about, the stigma is perpetuated by this kind of law that allows that to happen. There's no engagement with the fear of the person, the need for information, the need for communication. So you look at the CRPD, it counteracts all of those, concerns. So moving on then to look briefly at the hospital experience. Again, this was, these were the core sort of elements that came out of it. People felt trapped. They were constantly in a state of apprehension. And this is one I find, I think in a way it was a very strong outcome from the research, that they would comply with what was going on for release. They learned to play the game, or the words that were used by some people. And some people who'd been in the system before would say to the newer people who come into the system, this is what you need to do now, and Dr. So-and-so will release you if you play ball here. And that came out quite strongly. And that says to me, what does that say about the honesty of the therapeutic alliance for that person? That they can't be honest with the doctor because they're too fearful to be honest. And how can you have a fair therapeutic alliance with your counsellor, with the person who is meant to be helping you and bringing you through the system? and really assisting you with your psychological distress. I mean, Liz will know this was raised at some of our meetings. I probably shouldn't say that, but you know, it's just amazing how you could be blind to that fundamental of what you're trying to do as a professional. I don't get it. And then I suppose when you're involuntary, having that sort of label on you and knowing that you're trapped there, you feel very much like you've had your human rights taken away, and you have. You feel imprisoned, you kind of feel a second-class citizen. And that's it. Even when you're voluntary, you still don't have a whole lot to say. You can't walk out the door because there's a holding power. You can't just turn around and say, I'm off home, because if you say that, they might make you involuntary. So it's only a word, really, you know. And that is the thing about voluntary. We might be fooling ourselves and saying it's okay, but if you've been in a general hospital ever for something totally innocuous, and how do you feel? I often say this to the students. How do you feel when you get into the bed and you're in the bed in the hospital in your pyjamas in this strange environment, in a general hospital where there's no sense that the law can coerce you in any way, really? And you do feel that sense of away from your own reality and so on. So, and then when you add on all those layers of how you got there, the fact that you can be kept there, and you don't know how you might get out of there except to play this strange game to please other people, it's really unsustainable. And that Phil Fennell once mentioned this, the notion of the shadow of compulsion hanging over you all the time, even if you're voluntary. So this is it again. I had to say the right thing to everybody to get out. That's what I felt, that I had to say the right thing to everybody to get out of jail, basically. That's how the person saw it. I wouldn't want to be disagreeing with anybody or with the medication. So I just took everything I was given and, you know, tried to keep quiet and agree with everyone, you know, just to get out. That's how I felt. I was conscious of the last night. This is somebody else. I stay in hospital. I was just conscious of how do I look. I was starting to feel a little bit edgy that evening, thinking, well, hang on, you know, you've almost got the end in sight. But if you do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing, things could change. You mightn't be going home tomorrow, you know. Now, we have review of detention, but it doesn't get to something like that. It doesn't. It's a formalised system, and it's important right now. But, I mean, in that, it doesn't get to it, in my view. Okay, so going home then, and people expressed the fear of returning, living in fear all the time of returning, that the admission had induced trauma and stress, and stigmatised their identity. Some of them were taken away in a very public manner from their jobs, from in a restaurant, outside their house, where people were outside wondering what was going on, the kerfuffle over at the neighbour's house, and so on. So the impact of coercion here, you have to mind your P's and Q's when you're at home like that. You know, just, he's the husband, he's very good, but if you get into a mood and it lasted too long, he might sign me in again. So the fear that it invades your own home as well after you leave, that you can't get that out of your head. So when I came home into my own environment, it was like then I had to go through post-traumatic stress of being in the hospital. And within a few days, it did bring terrible anxiety over. I was terrified. I just went through a period of horrendous anxiety. Now, the thing is, I have been discharged from hospital, but I'm still extremely anxious. So is that right, really? So then in terms of going home, so I seen this van turning down the drive and I'm thinking to myself, I'm trembling inside. That's the National Assisted Admissions team coming along. You know, he's imagining every van that comes down his road, he imagines it's them, and so on. And then he felt he'd lost a lot of his friends because of the stigma associated with being forcibly admitted. And so on, neighbours and friends, you know, and she said, in that case it was a female, and she said it was very painful, of course. But on the other side, and this is the part we need to engage with in terms of changing laws and in including, you know, reflecting in laws in as much as you can do that, some people had very good encounters with staffs. You know, a percentage of people could recognise that. That's, you know, they were actively engaged in all of their plans and everything else. They were supported and they were given accessible information. So they encountered compassionate, collaborative and humanising care. They felt included in the admission, listened to and their opinion respected, and their personhood was also respected. And there's a quote there just talking about the doctor who was nice to the person and was compassionate, held her hand and so on. So finally, I'm going to, sorry, am I over time, Maria? Okay, I'm on 0. Okay, I'll race through this. This was done by one of the people who researched the qualitative, who did the research on the qualitative work, David McGuinness, Dr. David McGuinness. And he did this chart of losing control, regaining control, and maintaining control using grounded theory. And I just think it's useful. I didn't know whether I'd include it or not, but I said I would then in the end. And talking about losing control, in the losing control process, there were 3 critical factors: the diminishing self-mastery, control over oneself, feeling violated and being confined. And then regaining control was resisting the system, encountering humanising care. And that's the bit we need to embrace, the humanising care. That doesn't cost. That's an attitude and all the rest of it. Gaining perspective and playing ball. Again, that was back to that point. And maintaining control then is the 3rd level. In the maintaining control, 2 factors: managing one's mental health and preserving the sense of self. They were the 2 critical factors in that. So one of his key findings was when professionals assist service users in their pursuit of preserving control, then their experience was much more positive. So that was one of the outcomes. And my final slide then. So eliminating the burden of obstacles referred to by the UN Special Rapporteur on Monday. I believe that current mental health laws are obstacles to the realisation and perpetuate human rights abuses and perpetuate coercion. We need to embrace the values and principles of the CRPD, however we manage it. But we have hints from 1890 as to how to manage it. You know, we can go back and go forward and take the best. And the report of the Special Rapporteur recommends mainstreaming alternatives, having lots of non-coercive alternatives, developing a map to reduce coercive medical practices and establish an exchange of good practices between and within countries. So thank you for your attention.